Thank you. So, welcome, welcome, welcome. How many have heard of trauma-informed care? So, about maybe a third of you. Okay, so we're going to talk about some real basic information around that. Also, in terms of looking at a DEI, we know that DEI now is, well, it's part of trauma-informed care, but it's also, people are utilizing a trauma-informed care approach to address DEI issues in multiple settings. So we're going to talk about looking at this in higher ed. This is sort of new to higher ed, but has come more into focus since the pandemic. And so again, feel free to ask questions during whatever stuff doesn't make sense or you're having some reactions. Again, feel free to speak up and say anything that you need to say. Also, whenever we talk about trauma, it can be a time when people get activated, their own trauma gets touched. So again, if that is something that you may be experiencing, you start to feel that discomfort or uncomfortableness, that little knot in your throat, feel free to drink some water. That's one of the things we talk about that helps ground you and brings in that parasympathetic nervous system approach. But also if you need to doodle, that's fine. This is not a place you're going to get in trouble for doing that. Based on the neuroscience, we know that doodling is a way to help calm the brain when you get anxious and allows you to focus in. So again, these are things to think about also if you do any kind of teaching, that it's okay if folks are doodling. It helps them to focus in when they get to feel a little anxious and things of that nature. So we're going to just sort of jump right in here and talk about what our learning objectives are going to be. So again, as we talk about this and stuff comes up or you feel a little triggered, feel free to engage in some grounding activities. It could be even looking outside, looking at something else, tuning this out, whatever works for you. So we're going to start off by just sort of talking about what trauma is, what trauma isn't, recognizing how trauma shows up in higher education. We're going to look at how it impacts development as well as educational attainment. We're going to apply a trauma-informed paradigm to higher educational systems. So we're going to look at a couple of the systems that are here on your campus. And then we're going to talk about self-care, because again, we can't take care of others if we don't take care of ourselves. So anytime we talk about trauma-informed care, even though a lot of times folks tend to focus on who outward-facing sort of issues, we need to also look at how do we take care of the workforce. Because without a healthy workforce, it's going to be very hard to have a healthy campus. So I want to start with just sort of saying that, sort of setting the stage for trauma. And when we're talking about trauma, it's important to understand that it's not just the facts. It's not just about what is and what isn't. It's really about changing how you see the world. As I've done this presentation to numerous organizations and lay groups or anybody, one of the things that happens for them is that they have these aha moments that sort of say, oh, okay, well that's why so-and-so does it this way, or that's why this person acts in this way. Oh, okay, well that's what this means. And so again, just be open to some of those aha moments because it will change how you view the world. Again, the majority of us may not have had any sort of trauma, but a significant number of people have, and we'll talk about that when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, where the majority of people have had that, have had at least one. And then we're going to also, again, talk about when we're talking about trauma-informed care, we're looking at shifting that paradigm. In most helping professions, we sort of talk about, well, what's wrong with that person? We sort of have this pathology lens or this medical model lens where we focus on disease. But one of the things that trauma-informed care says is that there is no pathology. What we are recognizing, what we see, are normal reactions to extreme stress. Trauma being on that end of the extreme stress. And so it's important to keep in mind that we're not going to be asking what's wrong with people anymore. We're going to be looking at what happened to you. And so we want to make sure that we understand that this happened to someone and they're doing the best job that they can to recover from that. I always like to give the example that Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry, when he was on 60 Minutes and she interviewed him, she was saying how it transformed her her life to understand about trauma-informed care, and that it helped her to recognize that when her employees or her staff or folks that were working for her or would come to her with things that she may have normally said, this is outrageous, or what's going on with this person, what's wrong with this person. Once she understood trauma-informed care, she was able to switch how she saw her staff and her employees and started to see, okay, something happened, and I need to listen to understand what that is. And that's basically what we're talking about, is we want to shift out of this, oh, there's something wrong with you, othering people, again, around DEI stuff as well. But this is what happened to them, and they're doing the best job they can to recover from that or trying to figure all that out. And some people may not even be aware that they're acting in certain ways. And so again, we want to ask that person, what happened to you that got you to this place, as opposed to what's wrong with you. I know that my background as a therapist, I've found that when I have that conversation or make that shift with my clients who have gone to traditional mental health settings where they're always told that, well, this is what's wrong with you. This is your diagnosis. This is what you need to change. This is your fault, is how they hear it. And once I start to tell them that there's nothing wrong with them, that something happened to them and they're trying to figure out how to make it work, you almost get more eye contact, you see their shoulders go down, they relax more, they bring their head up, and it really starts to work on this issue of shame. Because when someone says something's wrong with you, then you feel ashamed. I did something wrong, I'm shameful. And so what we want to do is take that out of the equation when we're helping people and just really say that, something happened to you. And maybe you're not doing the best job of coping with it, but what can we do to give you other strategies to help you with that? And so again, we talk about it in terms of behavioral health, but it fits for every place where we are engaging with people in a helping way. I do this presentation with law enforcement. I do this presentation with attorneys, prosecutors. I did this with the Los Angeles City Prosecutor's Office to teach them about trauma-informed care. So this is a model or a paradigm that fits any sort of profession, especially where you're engaging with folks who may have, who are survivors of trauma. And so first, let's talk a little bit about what trauma is and what trauma isn't. There has been criticism that everything is trauma, therefore, it's a useless term. But I still think it makes sense to start to conceptualize what people's experiences are based on understanding the level of stress that they have gone through. And so when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about an event or a series of events that have caused the mind, the body, the spirit to fall out of balance. Okay, so we all like things to stay the same. All living organisms want to stay in this homeostasis perspective, if you will. And so when you've had a trauma happen to you, it sort of knocks you out of balance. It knocks you for a loop for a lot of folks. And so part of what people are trying to do is to get back in balance. And sometimes they use drugs, sometimes they use sex, sometimes they use shopping. They use a lot of different ways to try to get that balance back, to get that sense of control, which trauma sort of focuses on, is this sense of powerlessness, that I can't control what happened to me. I can't protect myself. So therefore, I'm going to do other things to sort of deal with that anxiety. And so these are just some dimensions that are affiliated with trauma. And so anytime there's a threat to your life or to your limb, you're going to have a traumatic response, okay? Anytime you feel your life is in danger, you're going to have some sort of response in your body. Any sort of severe physical harm or injury, and this also especially includes sexual assault, which is one of the most impactful types of traumatic experiences that someone can have. And so we're talking about childhood sexual abuse, we're talking about those folks growing up, entering into college, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that plays out. But because of our relationship in our culture, as well as many cultures, sexual assault or sexual or rape or however you want to call it tends to be very impactful compared to other types of traumatic experiences, okay? Because we have this sort of schizophrenic relationship with sex. And so anytime the body is penetrated, be it a knife, a bullet, a penis, if you will, if we're looking at it that way, or a foreign object of some kind, you're going to create a traumatic response in the body. It happens during surgery, which is one of the reasons why they kind of knock you out. so that you don't jump up and run out of the room. So any receipt of intentional harm or injury also can be seen as a trauma. And so again, we have people that have more traumatic response to man-made situations or man-made disasters or man-made trauma than natural disaster. So we can kind of get, this is out of our control, this is an act of God. We can kind of make peace with that. But when it's a war, when another person harms you intentionally, it takes another element that can really complicate recovery from that event. Any kind of exposure to the grotesque, if you're seeing something that's really horrible to look at, you're going to have a traumatic response. People love to get scared for Halloween because, again, it revs up some of those same sort of mechanisms, obviously not at the same level as a traumatic experience does, but you get that sort of high, that rush of adrenaline, okay? And so when it becomes a trauma, what happens is that it's too much. All right, and so when you're looking at something that's really grotesque, you'll get that same sort of rush. People who were here when the Twin Towers were hit in New York, that watched that on TV. I remember I was one of the people that was sort of watching the Today Show, and all of a sudden I see these planes hitting the building and then these things falling out of the building, which ended up being human bodies. So thinking about that, looking at that, a lot of people on the West Coast who are not directly impacted by that were experiencing what we call post-trauma stress disorder symptoms. This high anxiety, this feeling of out of control, things of that nature. And so one would say that that was grotesque to see a body falling out, or looking at body parts. If you're in the medical profession and you have to look at body parts, people sort of go into this sort of compartmentalization and sort of put it, okay, this is just an arm, but it's not an arm that's part of Mary, it's just an arm. And so they have to sort of do that in order not to get overwhelmed with the impact of seeing that as a whole person. So again, this exposure to the grotesque can be a traumatizing experience. Any kind of violent, sudden loss of a loved one is another type of trauma. So it could be to an accident, it could be suicide, it could be a homicide, any of those, the suddenness of it coming out of nowhere, we're not prepared for it, as well as the violent nature of that loss. And so again, what you'll see with people who have had someone in their family murdered or committed suicide the first 2 to 3 years, they're kind of like in a fog. They look like everybody else, nothing's wrong, they're going through the motions. But for them, it's just gray outside. It's, they feel kind of numb. They don't really feel anything. And so they just put one foot in front of the other and they keep moving. And then probably around 2 or 3 years later, all of a sudden, boom, it hits them and they fall down and think that they're going crazy. But in fact, it's just a delayed grief response. So we're going to be seeing a lot of that with folks who lost folks during the COVID pandemic, because again, it came out of nowhere. It didn't feel like it was in our control. And so therefore, it would be seen as a sort of violent end to someone's life in that regards. And so people go into what we call this sort of complicated grief process. And then witnessing or learning of violence to a loved one, which is one of the reasons why we want to protect children from witnessing domestic violence. But anytime you see someone that you care about hurt, it hurts you. That's because we are empathically connected to others. It's part of our biology as humans, as mammals, that we are connected. And so when something hurts somebody that we're connected to, it also hurts us. Learning of exposure to a toxic agent, I just asked people to think about COVID-19, think about HIV. Most of the people who've gotten an HIV diagnosis end up with another diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder because it is traumatic. This could kill me. It's not as bad now as it used to be, but when you got a diagnosis of HIV, it was a death sentence. And now that's not so true, but still, cancer diagnosis, any kind of diagnosis that is literally going to change your life could be seen again as this toxic agent. And then causing, the last one that you can't really see, is causing the death or harm or severe harm to another person. And so we see this in terms of one of the outcomes for people who have been in the military, is that they come back, and I think it's at 22 to 23 suicides per day veterans returning from war. And this is even if they haven't really seen combat, but may have heard about it, or they may have been involved. We're seeing nowadays that we have, one might say, sterilized combat so much in that you can push a button and kill like a bunch of people across the ocean. That is a very traumatizing experience for those who are engaged in that sort of killing someone. Even though people say, oh, it's like it could be like a video game, there are real lives attached to that. And so the implications of doing that harm causes what we talk about as a moral injury. And so that moral injury is seen as a traumatizing experience. So these are just some types of trauma that we'll talk about. So physical, I think are obvious. Medical trauma includes surgery. We see medical trauma with foster kids. Community colleges have a lot of foster children. And so that includes procedures that are painful. We see this with preemies who had to be poked and prodded and stuck with needles and stuff. And so they literally carry that trauma in their bodies, in their body limbs. And so you see them jerking a lot. Those are responses to being harmed in their body where they can't talk about it. Surgery is considered a medical trauma as well. Psychological trauma we're going to talk a little bit more about. Social or collective trauma, what do people think that might mean? Yeah. Watching the news could be considered a social or collective trauma, but even more than that, what does that mean? I know I'm gonna make your brain move a little bit in the morning time. Get all those carbs working in you. That great example. So a collective trauma or a social trauma means that a whole bunch of people went through that same event at the same time. So it could be an earthquake, a tsunami, any kind of event where everybody, the trauma we're going through, the pandemic is something we are all going through. So that would be considered a social or collective trauma. And so that has pluses and minuses. So on the front end, in the plus side, it means that we can all hang together, share each other's experience, provide that social support. But on the other end of that, if it continues on too long, then we see a breakdown in social networks. We see a breakdown in morals. We see communities say, well, you know what, this is continuing to hurt, we're just going to do stuff our way and go against what maybe the social norms would have been. Or you see people really isolating themselves. I was part of the federal response to the food poisoning in Flint, Michigan a few years ago. And when we went there because we knew the community was traumatized, and so I was a consultant for the feds to go in there and sort of provide some trauma-informed care. So there were several of us that went, and one of the things that, when we were there, one of the things I talked to one of the residents, and so we were just figuring out, okay, nobody shows up to these meetings, we're trying to have all these healing opportunities, these gatherings, yada, yada, yada. And so people weren't showing up, and so when I talked to one of the residents, he goes, I don't want to be in a room with a bunch of traumatized people. You know, why would I want to sit in a room with that? And if you've ever been in a room with someone who's really anxious, you just start to absorb that anxiety, and it just feels icky. So again, we had to rethink, okay, how are we going to get people to come out? How do we help people to recover from this trauma? That's also what we would call an environmental trauma, and that there was something that happened in the environment that traumatized the whole community of folks. How about historical or intergenerational trauma? I think people have heard that term before. What does that mean? Yes? Right, exactly. And so there is some difference between historical and intergenerational, and what you sort of described was more intergenerational. So let me talk about historical. So historical trauma is where a group of people who are connected culturally, it could be by their ethnicity, it could be by their region that they grew up in, it could be their race. And so we look at things such as the Holocaust. We look at things such as slavery, as the Armenian genocide, the genocide of indigenous people. Those are people that, again, are huge groups of people that are connected culturally, that have had some trauma that gets passed on generation after generation. And so most of this understanding of historical trauma came out of the study of the Holocaust survivors, 2, 3, 4 generations past, where they still had some trauma responses. And so now what we know is there's a science called epigenetics that looks at how trauma embeds itself in the DNA. And so even if you don't hear stories about the traumatic experience, that code will get passed down through generations. Trauma will travel up to 8 generations if there's no intervention, whereas alcohol and substance abuse may only travel 4 generations. So we're talking about a hugely impactful experience that will go on for generations after generations. And for African Americans here who are descendants of slavery, and we're told all the time, well, why aren't you over it? It wasn't that long ago. And then there's other mechanisms that are going on that keep that alive for us in terms of the ongoing systemic racism and other types of oppression that marginalized groups experience that fuel historical trauma. So whenever we're looking at where people are, we have to always look at them in the context of that historical trauma. And then intergenerational trauma is the same thing, only it's along family lines. So if your family, as was described, had domestic violence, it's going to get passed down through how we parent, things we talk about, who we get involved with in terms of toxic relationships. And so those sort of traumas get passed down through generations as well. And so you can understand that people may have multiple traumas based on their social identity. So if you are a person of color, if you are a person coming from an impoverished community, if you are a person of female gender, are you a person of LGBTQ? All of those types of marginalized communities have their social identities, and that each of those identities may have a trauma history attached to them. And so that's when we start to talk about intersectionality, which I'll probably talk a little bit more about later. But to keep in mind that that person that sits in front of you that you're working with may have multiple points of intersection in their lives where trauma has come in, okay, based on all of our identities. And then we have immigration trauma, which has 3 components to it: the trauma that pushes that person out from their home country, the trauma of the journey to the host country, and then the response that the host country puts out for that person. So if you think about immigration trauma, it is significant for people who are traveling here, coming up through Central America, coming up through South America, mostly Central America for here, looking at the Haitians and what's going on with them and how they have been treated since they came to America. That is traumatizing. And so different groups have different welcoming mats, if you will, that gets put out for them. So depending on where you come from can determine how your host country is going to respond to you. And so those sort of issues, all of that can be very traumatizing and feeds into this thing we call immigration trauma. Developmental or childhood trauma, we're going to talk a little bit more. It's trauma or adversity that has happened during childhood. Racial trauma, hopefully everybody kind of have heard that term, but basically it's based on your race or your ethnicity, where you have experienced microaggressions, if not direct bigotry, prejudice, systemic oppression. All of those issues have a traumatic response in someone. We know that from the research now, when they look at why there's such a high infant mortality rate for Black babies, they have controlled for poverty, education, everything, and the only thing left on the plate is racism. And so we know that racism is toxic from a trauma lens. And so if you look at it from a trauma lens, what happens is that every time you engage with someone who is anti-you for whatever reason, then what happens is that the body feels threatened and it produces stress hormones, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Those ongoing stress hormones, or this what we call an enduring trauma, ongoing trauma or chronic trauma, means that there's no escape from it, just like this pandemic, and so it starts to chew away at your insides and makes you at greater risk for coming down with different kinds of diseases and things of that nature. And like I said, there's chronic, ongoing, and enduring trauma. That means it's ongoing. We don't know when it's going to stop. We know when it began, just like this pandemic. We don't know when it's going to stop. People say, oh, it's going to stop on, October the 30th. We don't think so. So it keeps going on and on and on. As we say, the gift that keeps giving. So that pandemic is more impactful because we can't say when it's going to literally end. So therefore, our anxiety continues to be heightened around how it has changed our lives. People that we love and care about have been lost to it, and we don't know what's going to happen next. And so that kind of a trauma, just like child abuse, like domestic violence, where the victim and the victimizer are in a relationship for a period of time, is very impactful and more likely to cause harm ongoing for that person. And then vicarious, secondary, or compassion fatigue. Vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, or compassion fatigue is what you all have. And if you didn't know it, that you had it, let me inform you that you got it. All right? It is an occupational hazard of working in a helping profession. You are working with folks that are trauma impacted and you don't even know it. Okay? And some of you may acutely know it. But generally speaking, it's because you work in an environment where you're going to have high contact over a period of time with people who are survivors. And that's why we're going to talk about self-care. So it's important to keep in mind that traumatic events are external, but they quickly become incorporated into the mind and to the body. And when we're talking about trauma, it's important to keep in mind that trauma is a physiological response. We're talking about trauma responses, we're talking about a physiological, meaning that hormones are released, stress hormones, they go to places in your body, they cause your body to act in certain ways. And then what we talk about trauma, we usually talk about it from a psychological paradigm. But really, it's a physiological paradigm that we need to understand trauma, and that it embeds itself in your body in terms of body sensations. And then what happens is that we then interpret those sensations. For example, if you feel butterflies in your stomach, you know that there are not real butterflies in your stomach, but you associate that with what emotion? Nervousness, okay? So what we're talking about with trauma is same, is that you have these hormones raging through your body that are creating these body sensations that you interpret as anxiety, as powerlessness. And so what we talk about trauma now, rather than just sort of focusing on the psychological manifestations, that we talk about the physiological impact that it has. And these physiological impacts create these psychological manifestations like depression, anxiety, and things like that, which, again, are fine to talk about. But when you're talking about trauma, it is more than just that. It is trauma in the body. And so a lot of the interventions that used to be, oh, go talk to a therapist, don't work. Talk to the body. So yoga, things like that really focus on helping you get in touch with your body are seen as really important in survival of trauma. And we'll talk about that when we talk about self-care. So according to Judith Herman, and again, if you're really interested in knowing more about trauma, I always recommend Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery. It's a book that came out in the 90s, but it's probably in its 40th printing by now. And it is the Bible of traumatic stress. And so she describes trauma as this intense fear, this, in terms of psychological trauma, intense fear, a sense of helplessness, this, again, powerlessness, loss of control, because something happened to you that you could not change or you could not stop. And that's the worst feeling, to feel powerless. And then this fear of annihilation, which is very Freudian, but basically means this fear of death. And so what happens in the brain is that when you sense some type of threat in your environment, the amygdala, which is that little red bulb in the middle, gets activated. It has all of the sensory inputs coming through it: taste, smell, sound, sight. And so as it's scanning your environment and all the sensory input, it's noting if there's any kind of change. Change equals threat. And so the amygdala doesn't really think, it just reacts. And so you might see a shadow and then you jump, right? And then the prefrontal cortex, which is the thinking part of the brain, which is all that gray matter up there, steps and says, hey, that's just a shadow, chill out, amygdala. And it can calm it down. But let's say you're in an environment where you're constantly being threatened. What happens is that the amygdala hijacks all of the brain. Because again, your number one, what is the term I was going to say? Your number one reason for living, if you will, or is surviving. So if you don't survive, understanding math, being able to read means nothing. So the body is built for your survival. So when it's sensing a lot of stress or threat in your environment, the amygdala goes to work and it will truncate or unplug, you will, the prefrontal cortex or your rational brain. So that's why when people are afraid, they do stupid things. They do things that are irrational, that don't make sense, that are counterintuitive, because fear is driving your decisions, okay? And when fear drives your decision making, you don't make the best decisions. You think about immediately, what am I going to do to stay safe? Okay? And it's not even that conscious a thought. So the amygdala is not thinking, it is responding, it is reacting. So for example, these are folks that if you accidentally bump into them, they're going to want to fight you. Because you did it intentionally. That's how their brains have become wired. Is that every time there's an interaction with a person, it's a threat. And so when you're looking at folks who've grown up in very threatening environments, that their brain has been formed in that environment. And so they are hypersensitive to anything that looks like a threat. They can't just blow it off. It doesn't feel that way for them. They tend to misread social cues and always read them as threats, okay? Because that amygdala is still activated. It hasn't calmed down. And in some cases, we know that from MRIs as well as autopsies, that the amygdala is enlarged in people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so if you have an enlarged amygdala, it is more likely going to take over the rational brain in terms of thinking. So how does this impact in terms of academics? All right? If a student does not feel safe in the classroom, does not feel safe on campus, then their fear response is going to guide their decisions, okay? So we see this in our students at USC in terms of one of the things that happens with students who've had a lot of trauma before they come to campus is that once they get to campus, it feels like, woo, I'm free. But on the other hand, that freedom feels very anxiety provoking. So they engage in these high-risk behaviors such as substance abuse, such as binge drinking, which is one of the most dangerous patterns of alcohol consumption. We see it in college students across the board, especially in freshmen. And some of that is that they just haven't figured out how much they can drink before they pass out. So, and again, that's part of the developmental process. How many drinks can I have before I fall out? Everybody goes to college to figure that out. So this amygdala that is constantly activated due to a threatening environment impacts your ability to do well in school. As you see, this green structure in the brain is the hippocampus. That is where long-term memory lives. So as the memories come through the sensory, they get assessed through the amygdala, and then they get stored in the hippocampus. They get coded and stored for recall. But if the person is constantly agitated, if they're in this constant threat state, then the amygdala does not move that data into the hippocampus. So these students don't do well on tests. Doesn't mean that the information is not there, it's that it hasn't been coded for recall. So these high-stake tests that they were doing, students don't do well. So when we're talking about a trauma-informed approach, we're talking about keeping in mind what's going on in their head, in their brain, and how do we make our structures and systems responsive to how traumatized brains operate, okay? Does that make sense? All right. So that's kind of the premise, is that we want to make sure that we take into account that we may be working with brains that have been traumatized, and those brains tend to act differently than brains who have not had trauma. Now, it doesn't mean that these folks are not as intelligent, doesn't mean that these folks can't learn. It just means that they may have some barriers in learning that we need to take into account. I did my dissertation looking at elementary school, African American elementary school students who lived in or who attended schools in communities with high levels of community violence. And what I found, regardless of their income levels, because I looked at communities where there were high income levels, obviously not in poverty, and then I looked at communities where there were high levels of poverty. And what I found across the board, that students who were in schools, not even living there, but just going to schools, and again, at elementary school, you tend to live in the community that you go to elementary school at, were having lower test scores, significantly lower test scores than students who did not live in those communities, okay? And so again, it's about looking at what we call this achievement gap, this academic achievement gap, and it's not that, again, students of color, that's not their values, they don't care. Well, that's not true. Education has always been seen as a way out for African Americans. But what we are seeing happening at the same time is high rates of community violence, high surveillance rates by the police. These are all traumatizing community factors that impact educational attainment. And so these kids who are, smart as everybody else have to deal with this amygdala that is constantly activated and having to deal with that type of stress, those type of demands, looking over my shoulder, okay? Always on edge, always activated, is going to impact their ability to recall information that they have learned. And so again, you see this gap. So what I found is that achievement gap was significant. I mean, I forgot what percentage at this point. It was a long time ago when I did it. But it was a significant difference. We didn't see that in the white students who tended to have lower rates of community violence than communities of color, and in particular, African American communities. So why is this important? There's this thing called adverse childhood experiences. Has anyone heard of that study? Okay, so one or two people. All right, so adverse childhood experiences was a study that came out of Kaiser San Diego back in the late 90s that was joined by the CDC after about a couple of years. And this study looked at about 17,000 Kaiser patients, which is a huge sample size when you think about it. I think it was said that about 70% of the people who Kaiser reached out to responded to the study. And again, that's phenomenal. Most people, it's only like 33%. So to have such a huge rate of response to a survey says this is something people want to talk about. So Dr. Folletti, who was the principal investigator in this study, was finding that he's an internist at Kaiser San Diego, was wondering why his patients weren't doing as well as he thought they would have. He had a patient, and he worked with obesity and other types, smoking, things of that nature. And so he had a female who had lost, I think, about 100 pounds. And then he said, oh, you've lost the weight, as doctors always do. That's the most wonderful thing that could ever happen to you, is you don't have the weight. Really, doctor? She just showed him that that wasn't true. So what she became suicidal. She started having other acting out behaviors, and eventually she gained all the weight back. And he was like, what? I thought her life was beautiful now that she lost that weight. Doc, you got to see the whole person. So what he found out in talking to her was that she had suffered childhood sexual abuse. And then he started talking to some of the other internists, and they were saying, yeah, I noticed the same pattern with my patients. So they got together and said, you know what, we need to find out what's going on. So they developed a questionnaire, and you can go online to take this questionnaire. Before you do that, I always caution people it could depress the hell out of you, because what you'll find is there are 10 variables that they ask. All you do is say yes or no. Did any of this happen to you before the age of 18? And so that's what they did. They just sent out a list of questions. Did you experience any kind of child abuse? Did your parents divorce? Did any of your parents die? Was there domestic violence? Was there incarceration? Was there substance abuse or untreated mental illness? If any of these things happened in your home, you just said yes. And based on your score, they could determine your developmental trajectory. Okay, kind of scary. So for a male who had, I think it was six or higher number of ACEs, again, not a huge number, he had a 4,800% greater likelihood to become a heroin addict compared to someone who had 0, okay? At about 3 adverse childhood experiences, developmental damage occurs. So what they were able to find is that in almost 70% of the Kaiser patients who participated in this survey, that they had at least one trauma in their lives. I mean, how many people have had divorce? That's considered a traumatic experience in childhood. The separation from a parent. So we can think about how many people have had divorce. So that's at least one. And then in a lot of families, they've got more. And so what they found is that almost 50% had 1 to 3 traumatic experiences or adverse childhood experiences. Philadelphia said, well, you know what, we want a group that's a little more diverse. So the San Diego Kaiser population was predominantly white. I think it was about 80% white, college educated. Well, you know, who has Kaiser, right? 80% white, college educated, middle class, upper middle class folks. So these were the so-called privileged people, right? And if they're having almost 70%, 50%, et cetera, in terms of adversity, what must folks who live in marginalized communities have? So Philadelphia says, you know what? We're going to look at what you did, but we're going to do it with a much more diverse population. And so they looked at their folks in Philadelphia, and then they also looked at, well, what happens in the community in which you live? That has to have an impact on you. So they looked at community factors such as racism or discrimination. They looked at foster care. They looked at community violence. One of the questions is, did you even feel safe in your neighborhood growing up? You know, a lot of kids talked about, you know, I had to step over bodies to get to school, right? Or they asked you if you ever saw a body or anything like that. So they asked these questions in addition to the original ACE questions and found even higher rates in their community. And so one of the most important things that came out of the ACE study is that they found that there was a dose relationship between the number of ACEs and adult health outcomes, okay? So the more items you checked yes to on the ACE survey, the greater the likelihood you would develop cancer, diabetes, lung disease, hypertension, mental health issues, substance abuse. All these sort of chronic diseases have a high correlation, almost causal, to the number of ACEs that one has. And so engaging in high-risk behaviors. And so again, ACEs in communities of color, again, for Philadelphia, 40% of they experience 4 or more, which is huge. You know, we already said developmental damage happens at 3. They only went down to 4 because there were so many people that had 3, pretty much a lot of folks. So they looked at 4 or more of folks had these ACEs in Philadelphia. A quarter of the residents live in poverty. Researchers found that almost 7 in 10 adults had experienced 1 ACE and 2 in 5 had experienced 4 or more. So this is what the impact of childhood trauma has developmentally. It impacts your ability to think or your cognition. It impacts your physical health, brain development. Children, I have a slide when I do this more around kids that talks about the brain size. So kids who have had a lot of trauma, their brains are smaller than kids who have not, literally smaller, okay? Some of the structures of the brain are smaller, such as the hippocampus. That's important for learning. So the hippocampus has smaller volume, but the amygdala is enlarged. So that's going to impact, again, a lot of the processes that go on in the brain. Their behavior is different. They have more challenges with regulating their emotions. They go from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds in terms of being upset. More mental health issues. It impacts their relationships. They tend to be more toxic relationships, as well, again, as having a lot of trouble controlling their emotions. And then again, the physical stuff. So sleep disorders is number one. So you'll have students that come in a lot with, I can't sleep. So this is the pyramid related to adverse childhood experiences. So as you see, on the bottom level, you have the adverse childhood experiences, and on top of that, that contributes to disruptive neural development. When I talked about structures in the brain literally change their size, as well as the brain itself. Social, emotional, and cognitive development becomes impacted, sometimes truncated. They start to adopt these health risk behaviors, smoking, drugs, alcohol, all these sort of high-risk behaviors that put you at greater risk for other things happening later on. This then leads to the development of chronic diseases, disability, more social problems, and ultimately an early death. Not to depress you. Okay, just to inform you. So just breathe. Everybody take a breath. Okay. So, all that being said, what does that have to do with us? Well, let's talk about the prevalence of ACEs in our college students. Studies have found that anywhere between 56 to 89% of college students have had at least one ACE. So what we're seeing is even higher rates in college students. And then that also includes the more severe ACEs. And 22% reported symptoms consistent with the post-trauma stress disorder. Community colleges, college students report even higher rates of ACEs. Again, it's based on who goes to community colleges. Again, community colleges tend to have more students of color, more students from poverty, veterans, foster care youth. All of these youth that we know have had a lot of trauma or adversity growing up, community college is usually where they start. And so community colleges are more impacted by adverse childhood experiences than, say, a four-year college is, all things being equal. Another study looked at the dropout rate of freshmen who had ACEs, and what they found is that after that first semester, those students who had ACE scores typically dropped out sooner, especially if they had child sexual abuse. So they had a higher rate of dropout right after the first semester even. So again, this gives us some things to think about in terms of where we put our supportive systems. So having mentor programs in that first semester for all students, because you don't know who's a trauma survivor, is important. Building attachment relationships in that first semester are important. So from a systemic place, we talk about how do we build those sort of relationships? What do we do differently to, again, help those students attach to their college? If we don't do that, they're at greater risk for dropping out before they even make it to the second semester. And then once students get to college, especially those students who have a lot of ACEs, they're at greater risk for having for having traumatic experiences. So even students that we don't even know have background in adversity, 23% of the undergraduate women and about 5.4% of the men have reported being sexually assaulted. We know the first 6 weeks of the freshman term is the most dangerous, if you will, for freshman women. That's when most of them are going to be assaulted, is in that first 6 weeks, okay? So what are we doing during those first 6 weeks of that semester to help folks feel safer? What are we doing? Now for USC, there was a study that was done for Division I colleges, and those are colleges in the NCAA that have huge football programs. And obviously USC has a huge football program. Not as big as it used to be apparently, or not as impactful as it used to be, but still part of the culture. Significantly part of the culture at USC. And so they looked at all these Division I schools, and they found that during home football games, sexual assault rose almost 57% during just those football games, home games. They rose 15% when it was a away game. Okay? Now, that is not to say that football causes sexual assault. Not what I'm saying. It's the behaviors associated with a home game that puts you at greater risk for being assaulted. So it's partying, it's drinking. You know, we have this thing where students start on one side of the campus because we have the Coliseum on the other side of our campus. They start drinking, they start gaming, as the kids call it, 6 in the morning if it's a 1 o'clock game, right? Because we got to be drunk by the time we get to the stadium. Stagger across campus to get to the Coliseum before they collapse in urine in their pants, okay? So there's a famous little gate that USC, that our police officers talk about, where the students end up going through that is like a horror zone. It's almost like that movie, what is it? Not The Apocalypse, but the movie where everybody does crazy stuff for 24 hours. The Purge. Yeah, it's kind of like The Purge. So this is what happens around. So it's the culture around football that puts freshman women at greater risk for being sexually assaulted. So that's part of what happens. But again, just coming to college where you're not with your parents to tell you what to do, you got to make your own decisions, and we already know adolescent brains don't make great decisions. Because all of you know that the brain isn't fully developed, hopefully you know, until about 25, give or take. For men, it's a little later. It's like 27 to 29. I'm just saying. I'm just reporting the news. Just reporting the news. Women already knew this, but just in case the guys weren't aware. So we know that the adolescent brain is working overtime in college years. And so community college, you tend to have, I think, a more diverse age population, sometimes older students. I know now at Pacific Oaks, our population skewed older than in the traditional four-year college. But again, keeping all that in mind, we also know that some student cohorts already have higher rates of traumatic experiences, especially our communities of color, our LGBTQ communities, our foster youth communities. All these communities tend to come in with higher adversity before they even hit college. And that adversity makes you at greater risk for becoming re-victimized when you get to college, okay? For a number of reasons, which again, that would be a whole nother course on trauma. 66% of college students report experiences of sexual harassment. One of the major issues on college campuses is peer sexual harassment. For our graduate students, it's faculty or staff sexual harassment. So how does this impact college students? Our college campuses, higher rates of suicidal ideation. If I don't have one student come in every day to the counseling center that doesn't, I mean, we have hospitalized probably in 1 week 100 students. Now, granted, we are 46,000 students on campus, but even that is significantly higher than what we've ever seen before. And let's not even talk about COVID, which I'll talk about. But that's because of COVID, partly, but also it's the nature of the beast. College mental health is becoming a place that we have to invest in. We are not and have not. Colleges see themselves as not providers of mental health services. But guess what? Students are going to make you providers of mental health services because they're here. And colleges have to take care of their students. So we have to start to invest in mental health services on campus. And I know for community colleges there are more challenges and barriers for that, but I also know the state of California had some grant monies for community colleges to get money for foster youth, but also some mental health monies. Don't know if it's still there, but if it isn't, we need to advocate, because community colleges are seeing folks with more and more traumatic experiences and are less equipped with the resources to address that. So a lot of suicidal ideation and behaviors, alcohol abuse, especially binge drinking, which is, again, one of the most dangerous types of drinking patterns. High rates of re-victimization. Students who were sexually assaulted before they got to campus are the students who are going to be sexually assaulted when they get to campus. So many of our students who come to my program, which deals with students who have been harmed by gender-based violence, were victimized in childhood, okay? They tend to drop out, which we talked a little bit about already, and they engage in more high-risk behaviors. We are going to start looking at our students who come into our Student Health Center to look at, we know that people who have high scores of ACEs tend to utilize health services more so than people who do not. So we're going to start to screen our students who come into student health for the level of ACEs that they have so that we can reach out early and provide more prevention and early intervention. Because these students will become mental health students within the first year that they're in college. Students who've had traumatic experience have a harder time adjusting to college within the first 12 months of college. They will seek out mental health services, and half reported trauma histories as part of why they were seeking out those services. Again, higher rates of depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. Students who had exposure to one ACE had more health-related complaints. So we get students who come into health services with all kinds of complaints. So academic impacts. Many studies have discussed the impact of trauma on academic attainment. Again, we've seen that there may be lower IQ scores, up to 8 points. Lead poisoning is only 4 points, okay? Lower test scores, higher dropout rates, disruptive behaviors, et cetera. And so again, these are some of the things that we see in terms of how their academics are impacted. And then the ways that it shows up for y'all sometimes is they can't complete their tests or assignments, so they're coming in for what? Accommodations. I just had a student that said, you know, what did he say? Oh, somebody had reported him for a sexual assault like a year ago, and he wants an academic accommodation because he's stressed out over it. Okay? Not denying that he isn't stressed out over someone accusing him of sexually assaulting him. They need more time to complete their papers. They make requests for special considerations. I can't tell you, I have a volume of people requesting for some sort of an accommodation. Again, dropping out within the first year of college, missing classes. These are the students that miss classes a lot. And then they're unable to comprehend instructions or listen to lectures. So if it's a professor who does a lot of lecturing to a large room like this, you're going to lose them. And so these students don't do well with lectures because, again, that auditory stuff goes in the ear, gets jumbled up, and is not able to be processed because they're anxious, or they're really, well, they're anxious is the best way of putting it. And so when they're anxious, they can't focus in and absorb that information. So we are at about an hour now, so I want to be mindful of that and give everybody like a 5-minute break, 10-minute break, 5-minute break, 5-minute break, and then we'll start it, we'll come back. So take a 5-minute break.
So it just looked like I just had to move like 3 of your slides. So I'm not sure why it did that. Um, 18.
Thank you.
Okay.
You made it right. Good. So yes, we are pretty much back. With all that anxiety. And our students are ready. So our numbers
You ready, Freddie? If I ask them to come back together? Yeah. You didn't hear my whole little introduction. So sad. Yeah, well, that's what's important. Oh, thank you. You're gonna bring it back together.
Yeah.
Oh, you found a few.
Huh? Oh, yeah. I said I haven't handed these out. They look grody. I said they've been in my purse for like 2 years.
Have you done other in-person training?
This is
You
the
gotta be
first
kidding
one.
me.
This is the first
All
one.
right, Dr. Ingram, you're not gonna forget me then.
No, I won't. If I go home sick, I won't forget you. So let's come back together. Any comments or questions so far? Stuff that doesn't make sense? We're kind of transitioning sort of into trauma-informed care. Yes?
My coordinator for our formerly incarcerated student program wants Timothy to show this video in his class.
Yeah.
It's being recorded.
Yes. Okay, hold on a second. Say that again? I didn't hear all of it. For the 23% of students? Oh, 66 report sexual harassment? Not off the top of my head. The AAU service is the American Association of Universities, and they do a climate study and a misconduct study around sexual misconduct, if you will, every 4 years. They did one in 2015, and then they did the other one in 2019. You can go online and you can pull down the data. So they do it in an aggregate, but then they also do each individual school gets their own report. So USC participated in that survey. There's probably about 27 other, I think 30 in 2019, universities participated in that. So I assume it's going to be ongoing every 4 years. It's an expensive survey to be a part of, just FYI, but I think it's one of the few places where we have this national data about what's going on with college students. And unfortunately, USC, in that particular study, had one of the highest rates of sexual assault. For the overall study was 23%, but USC was at 31% of our undergraduate females reported having been sexually assaulted. And I always tell people to put that in the context of Los Angeles, which has about a 33%, so that people don't start freaking out and saying, oh my God, what's going on over there at USC? Again, you can say what's going on over there at USC for a number of reasons, but that particular rate is also congruent with what's going on in Los Angeles. So we sort of hopefully I've laid the groundwork for why we need to do this stuff, why we need to look at trauma, what the prevalence is across not just our college population, but our communities at large. California has a project called ACEs Aware Initiative, which you can Google. And it's talking about, and one of the reasons why I push it is because it's really, they're looking at primary care settings. Oh, getting hot now. Primary care settings, but what we want is all settings, school settings included. And so what I found is that in that initiative, USC is probably the only institution of higher education that they tell me. I say, what? There's got to be some other people besides USC in this. And they're like, nope, we can't find any. So this issue of trauma-informed care and higher ed is new to higher education, but it is so important. Again, I think we're seeing a lot more of it coming to the forefront in terms of discussions, research, articles due to COVID, but it's equally as important that we start to bring this to our campus because it impacts our students, and that's why we're all here, is to make sure our students are successful. So why we talk about trauma-informed care, what does that mean? And again, this is not to make this a primary care or behavioral health care setting, but to recognize that there are going to be students that require a level of care, and that as helpers, we all engage in care. It looks different depending on your department, depending on your role, depending on your organization, but it is still care. And so that's why we use trauma-informed care. You may hear people say trauma-informed approaches or interventions, but it's really this care model that we want to bring to organizations that are working with folks that have high rates of trauma. And so it's an organizational structural framework that involves understanding. I'm going to trip over these cords, I can just tell at some point. Involves understanding, recognizing, and responding to the effects of all types of trauma on well-being and behavior. So we look at the whole person. We don't just look at what they came with. We understand that trauma impacts every aspect and part of your life, and that we need to look at all of those pieces. that trauma-informed care emphasizes safety above all else. And so how do we make our campus safe? How do we make our interactions with our students safe? How do we make our interactions with each other safe? You know, how do we instill moral safety, meaning we do the right thing, we have integrity in our decision making? And again, this is really nothing new. We're just sort of packaging it under trauma-informed care. It's really best developmental practice. So if you know adult learning theory, you know developmental practice theory, this is not rocket science. This is just that in this package of trauma-informed care. And so, you know, how are we psychologically safe? What do we do? What are the behaviors that we need to demonstrate? Okay? And then we want to help build a sense of control and empowerment, because as I said before, one of the major aspects of trauma is the sense of powerlessness, is that I didn't have control over something that happened to me. And so what we want to do is sort of reframe that and shift that for folks by helping them to understand where can they take control of their lives. And sometimes, you know, just in a very subtle way, it could mean where the person sits in the room. So as a therapist, you know, everybody believes, oh, well, you got to sit over there and the therapist sits over here. But an empowering approach is to say, you sit wherever you want to sit in this room. You may sit in the therapist's powerful chair. That's okay, because it makes you feel more powerful. And the therapist needs to step back and sit in the less powerful position to share that power. And so when we're talking about DEI, we're talking about privilege and power. And so trauma-informed care takes that power relationship into account as we decide what it is that we're going to be doing with folks. So we try not to do power on, we try and do power with. So we look for opportunities to share power. So think of opportunities that you have to share power. So in our student healthcare system, one way to share power is to have student advisory groups that come in and literally tell us, this is what we need as students. This is how we need this service to be. On the committee that I work on, the Trauma-Informed Work Group, we have students that are part of that group who give us the student perspective. So those are ways to empower student voice, to have more voices at the table, to help us to make sure that the services that we are designing have the voice of the people that these services are for. Never do something without the voice of the recipients in that. So, and again, that helps to build this sense of control and empowerment. And then we make sure that we work with systems that are also trauma-informed. So if I do all this great trauma-informed work over here, and then I send you over here and they ain't trauma-informed, you're going to be re-traumatized, and then all the hard work that I did is going to go down the tubes. So I need to reach out to my village and make sure that all the people in my village understand trauma and are trauma-informed, so that when I need to hand this student off to from financial aid to, you know, basic needs group or whatever you have, that those folks are going to treat them as well as I did based on a trauma-informed approach, okay? So even though at USC right now the focus has been on student health, it's interesting that organically we're seeing it pop up at other places on the campus without having taken this huge formal, we are all going to become a trauma-informed campus. We started with student health. People were like, hey, we want to do that. So I did this presentation that I'm doing with you all, a little smaller version, as keynote for our Student Affairs Institute during the summer, a couple of summers ago, before, well, summer 2019, before we all disappeared. We did it with like 300 of our student affairs folks on campus. Because again, the word is getting out that, ooh, we want to understand how this works. We're doing it with the academic advisors so that they understand what does trauma-informed care look like in our role in the institution. And so we find that just organically is popping up. I'm in the Keck School of Medicine, which is part of Keck Medicine, which is a huge enterprise, sort of part of USC, sort of on their own, but related somehow. And so now I'm getting calls from Keck Medicine, which is a huge enterprise, business enterprise, that is interested in understanding more about and becoming trauma-informed. So it's just happening around the campus. that different organizations, I did this presentation for our Faculty Senate a couple of years ago as well, because they were looking at, okay, what is this, how do we bring this into the classroom? And again, this was before COVID, and this was before it became super obvious as a result of COVID that we need to be trauma informed. So again, we want to start to build those close-knit relationships with other folks on campus and making sure that they all have been trauma informed. And so again, why are these services important or approaches necessary? It improves educational outcomes. There's enough research now that shows that where there is trauma-informed approaches used, students do better. They do better in terms of reduction in some of the, again, they look mostly at primary grades and secondary grades, so they saw that students had better behaviors. There was less likely to be students being referred out to the principal's office, if you will. Clearly, you don't do that here. But you might have students that are not engaging in as much disruptive behavior in the classroom, not having to come up before the judiciary hearing groups here. You start to see more of them, again, addressing any of their potential misconduct. But it's also in that it changes the system. So we have this thing called amnesty, that if you engage in drinking or using drugs, obviously you can be brought up before the judiciary committee. But we have amnesty that if you know something is happening and you say something, that you have amnesty and you won't be brought up for drinking. Oh, I saw so-and-so get hurt while we were all drinking. So supposedly you have amnesty. So one of our students came to our public campus safety officer and said, you know what, I think I was drugged while I was at a party having alcohol. So our good campus police officer, doing his job, wrote him up, sent it to student judiciary. So I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, I thought we had amnesty. And so again, having to go back to DPS, I just had a meeting with them yesterday about this, that's not cool. I said, and they go, maybe there was something else, there may have been something else, but this is the narrative that's on campus now. Amnesty doesn't work. And so you need to go back and revisit amnesty, you need to make sure all the officers understand that if a student is coming telling you something that they need help with, that they're not to be written up to go to student judiciary. That's not okay. So that wasn't a trauma-informed approach. We're also trying to do trauma-informed with our campus police too, so just FYI. We're working with them as well to get them trauma-informed. So we want every aspect on our campus, especially our public safety officers, to be trauma-informed as well. So again, we know that it improves educational outcomes. It supports personal development and well-being of students. Again, we're empowering them, we support them, we're compassionate for them, we're doing all that we can. We make sure that, again, that they're able to attach, because learning happens in attached relationships. Again, adult learning theory for all the lifespan, is that if there's not an attached relationship, it's going to be very hard for that person to learn. We prevent re-traumatization, because we try and act in a way that doesn't do that. And again, that doesn't mean that people are going out traumatizing folks. Okay, let me see how I can traumatize someone. Is that you may do something inadvertently that leads to traumatizing experience for that person. And so, again, when you understand these sort of things, you do better. And then again, it supports the staff. It supports the faculty, the staff, and the students. It's not enough to just focus on student well-being if we don't focus on the workforce well-being. And so again, it's about acknowledging, recognizing that trauma is pervasive, impacts individual students and the university environment, introducing factors that reduce negative outcomes for college students with ACEs. Again, this presence of a supportive system. What kind of supportive system do we have? What do we need to upgrade on for our students so that they feel supported? They have this secure attachment. How are our systems flexible? We have conversations we sent out, especially during COVID, to the professors, basically saying, you know, chill out on the tests. Let's have some flexibility. Let's take into account that people got other things going on besides your class. And let's hold them accountable, but in a way that is compassionate and supportive of a student. Doesn't mean we're going to drop the standards, but it means we don't have to do 4 papers in 2 weeks. Maybe we can do 2 papers in 2 weeks. So we're asking our faculty to be more flexible, to show compassion, to recognize what students are going through, that they're already overwhelmed. We have an interesting phenomenon, as a lot of four-year colleges have right now, is that we have 2 years of first-year students, okay? It's bad enough with 1 year of first-year students, but we have 2 years of first-year students, meaning that we have students who are just coming to college and having that college experience for the first time, figuring it all out. They're not available to that freshman class as they normally would be to sort of mentor them. And so that means we have to do twice as much. So all those first year's experiences that they would have passed developmentally, they're just having now, all right, with the first years that are coming in. So again, how do we recognize that? How do we be flexible? How do we support that? How do we increase our compassion, recognizing that this is going on our campus? And then we want to become that resource for students who have had traumatic experiences. Doesn't mean I want my students to come to me during my office hours and I become their therapist. That's not what we're talking about. What we're saying is that we want to have those resources. We can put them in our syllabus, we can do whatever, but what are the resources for students? Because when a student comes to you, and usually for faculty, when I have this conversation with faculty, they said students are coming to you first. They see you most often. Just like in elementary school or junior school or whatever, students go tell their teachers stuff, okay? They're going to come to you, okay, in your roles, and how are you going to show up for them? Those are things to be thinking about. And so how do I become that resource? How do I recognize that that's what's going on? And that's, again, part of what this whole presentation is about. And so we want to connect. When we're talking about the essentials of trauma-informed care, it's about relationships, relationships, relationships. Safe relationships. Supportive relationships. Those are the things that we want to emphasize. We want to promote safety and trustworthiness. Being transparent is part of that. You know, if I have something, I need to tell that student what I know. And I always tell folks, you know what, I'm trying to be as transparent as possible. Okay, again, not going to breach confidentiality. I'm not going to say things I shouldn't say, but I'm going to err on the side of being more transparent than less transparent, because that builds trustworthiness, which builds people feeling safe. Again, how do I help them to choose? How do I work collaboratively? Look at them as a partner in all of this, as opposed to I'm telling you what to do. Provide opportunities, again, to control situations. Make sure that I understand cultural sensitivity and engage in recognizing not just group culture, but individual culture. So we have an individual who is part of a larger group in terms of their family, part of a larger group in terms of their cultural group, and a larger group and a larger group. What's my understanding of all of that? And so cultural competence is sort of going out the window. Cultural humility is coming in. Because we know that this is a process, not a product. So competence talks about it being a product. You're here. You've learned everything you can learn about it. Cultural humility says it's a process where you always have to be open to hearing and learning about this. So how do we, again, deal with our own barriers, our own, get in our own way, if you will, around understanding someone's culture? It's about asking questions. It's about recognizing our privilege. It's about recognizing our power. And then how do we use that in a way that supports students and empowers them? Okay? And you have to be able to give away some of your power and your privilege. Okay? Or how do I bring my privilege into change systems? Okay? So my role at USC as a director, as a clinical professor, I have privilege attached to that. My social identity as a Black woman, not so much. But how do I take that privilege and power in my role at USC to make more equitable transactions on campus? That's what I have to do. That's what I look for. I'm strength-based, and so how are we strength-based? How do we build on what the student does well as opposed to focus on their deficits? Well, you don't do this well. You don't know how to do that. Well, what does a student know how to do? What do they do well? How do I build on that? And again, that reframe is so important when you're working with students to accomplish something, because again, it helps them to feel that they can change the world. And that's really why folks come to college, is to take that next step and to make a difference and to have purpose. And then always about being compassionate and supportive. So again, these are just the 4 R's of trauma-informed approach, which we've sort of talked about. This comes out of SAMHSA, which is a Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is part of the federal government. They have a lot of programs in SAPSA talking about trauma-informed care, looking at it in terms of the educational field. They look at it in terms of the criminal justice field. And so what the federal government has said historically, not super long ago, but minus the last 4 years and going back, is that they want people to be trauma-informed. They want primary care. They want behavioral health. They want all educators. We talk about that in terms of Title IX. There is language in California, Title IX, that says you will, all Title IX folks who are investigators or whatever will have a Title IX trauma-informed training. So it is recognized as a paradigm that we need to have across the board in our country, and the federal government supports that and gives money to help you do that. And like I said before, California ACEs Aware also gives money, especially if you take Medi-Cal. So if people become trauma-informed, if people become ACEs Aware, there's opportunities to bill at higher rates for Medi-Cal services. So again, all you gotta do is go to ACEs Aware Initiative for California. And again, this framework of trauma-informed is applicable to all organizations, all settings where we are engaged in a helping relationship. And so trauma-informed college and university departments are designed to support the academic mission of the university. Again, we're not here to be therapists, we're not here to do that, but how we fulfill our department's mission can change based on what is the model of care, or what is the model of practice, what is our business model. It's designed to support the academic success of students, and again, not designed to make you into clinicians to treat symptoms of trauma. So from a student affairs perspective, it's like all departments: career services, financial aid, admissions, academic advising. All of these programs or departments, we want them to be trauma-informed, because again, when that student comes to you, financial aid, and they're talking about something that's going on, or they need more money or whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to give them more money, but it does mean that I need to listen in a way that recognizes that they may be suffering from early trauma that is impacting their ability to take care of themselves right now. We get a lot of situations. We have, we're like the Rape Crisis Center. My program is on campus, and so we have advocates. And I can't tell you how many students come to our advocates because something happened to them, and they were either sexually assaulted or they were living with someone and they ended up in a domestic violence relationship, and now they're homeless. And so we got to find a place for them to live. So fortunately, USC has some resources, and so we are able to place students in housing. That's not true for all campuses. I have to say, USC has huge privilege. And so they're able to do a lot of things. But honestly, they have always had huge privilege. My department didn't get growed until after we had a scandal. So, institutions are moved by their image. And so I look at it as both a crisis as an opportunity that has met some danger. So we are where we are. We are becoming trauma-informed, not because of the Board of Trustees sat down and said, this is just the right thing to do. Right? And I know I'm on the internet, so take my name off of the piece of paper, as I'm being very transparent. We got trauma-informed because somebody told us we better get trauma-informed. But on the flip side of that, it's been great for our campus to engage in this process of becoming trauma-informed. We have learned so much about ourselves, about how we need to protect students in ways that we clearly weren't doing before, which is how we ended up where we were. We were not taking the safety of students as our primary goal. So again, how do we do all of this? It's amazing how institutions can find money when their feet are placed to the fire, and I'll leave it at that. So again, practicing this flexibility and compassion in our services, especially in student affairs, build consistent and supportive relationships, especially in that first semester. So thinking when you leave here, what can we do in that first semester that we're not doing that can wrap our arms around our students and keep them here? Even for our academic affairs, again, how do we support our faculty to provide the highest quality teaching research and to integrate trauma-informed perspectives in their teaching. Okay? So we assist faculty from academic affairs or faculty affairs to incorporate trauma-informed pedagogy. How do we support our faculty in doing that? We want them to understand that teaching is multimodal, as well as sensory, especially when you're working with students who have had trauma. So you can't just stand up there and lecture. It doesn't work. So what other kinds of methodology can you bring in? What other kinds of modes of learning? Groups work really well. Cooperative groups, not competitive groups. Building relationships, building community in the classroom. All of those things are best practices when we're talking about our faculty. And yeah, it helps faculty to work smarter, not harder. And this is real apparent now in this semi-post COVID world, that it takes longer, that students take longer to process when they have been trauma in their lives. And so having a paper that's due the second day of class is a little fast. So maybe it might make sense to have that paper due maybe a week later. So how do we put that understanding of how students' brains work as a result of having had trauma and put that and incorporate that into our how we roll out our courses, into our curricula, okay? And recognize this thing called process speed. Faculty development and works to reduce burnout. What are we doing to help support our faculty, our workforce in that regards? What are our policies and practices that we need to look at? Again, I talk about our amnesty policy. Clearly, we need to re-examine that one a little bit. Develop and revise policies on admissions. I remember I had somebody ask me, how come we're not giving an ACE survey during the admissions? Because you could discriminate and not let someone in if they have too many ACEs. So we're not doing it at that point. But once they're here, we use that ACE survey to support our interventions, our early interventions and preventions, because we know that if we reach out early to those students who have certain ACE scores, because the goal is to make them successful, not to eliminate them from admission. So we don't want to change our admission policy, but what does it look like? What are things that could be barriers for students? Students complain a lot about that biographical statement that they have to do, and so what can we do to make that easier for them? Because again, for a student that may have some trauma, it's going to be hard for them to write that sometimes. And they could still be great students, okay? Or take that SAT or GRE for graduate students. Do we need those? Do we really use them? Research has told us they are not the best predictors of success at the higher level. So a lot of institutions are starting to throw those out. So do we develop academic programs that reflect a trauma-informed approach for diverse student populations, such as academic programs for veterans? What are our veterans programs like? I hear you have a program for students who have been formerly incarcerated. So how are we targeting student cohorts and providing those supportive services so that they can be successful on campus? So what does this mean for my department and my work? So this is a time I want to take a time for you all to have conversations at your table. And think about a student that you have worked with that you found difficult or challenging. Does this information change your thinking about this student? If so, how? What is the mission of my department and how does it fit with trauma-informed? How would you change your department's processes, protocols, or your work as a result of understanding trauma? And I know you're not going to get through all these questions, so some of these are just thought-provoking. And development of an action plan. Who are the key players? Who do I need to bring to the table so that we can become trauma-informed? What is this analysis of policies and practices? How is all that going to happen? And then what's the timeline? So these are all some of the key points you need to think about. Obviously not going to happen today. So if you can at least do the first couple of questions at your table in a discussion, give you about 10 minutes for that, and then we will move on. Maybe 7 minutes.
They're getting close to closing out only because I'm going to double check with Dr. Olivo because this is helps and her students. They just want to retreat breakfast.
Okay, so is it 10:30 or 10:40? I thought it was 10. What is it?
10. We were doing 8:30 to 10:30.
Okay,
But
all
let me
right.
see if we go into the 10:40 because I don't want to miss out on whatever it is that you have coming next to kind of close it out. So maybe we'll bring them back together in about
Well,
5
after
minutes.
this, there isn't that much more.
Okay, that's fantastic. And then what I'll do in my quick closing is just remind them to go back to this slide. Will you be providing the slides, Dr. Ingram? Perfect.
Yeah, I can email them to you.
Perfect. So I'll go ahead and post it on our division page. They have to have a pasadena.edu to access it. Um, but this maybe would be a nice kind of like 2.0 to like an extension of today's conversation for them to start that conversation. And what I'm also offering is that in consultation with you, that we're able to, bring you back on to connect with different departments who want to move forward in creating
Sure.
that action plan. So we can chat about what that might look like. in
Okay,
practice.
no problem. Hi, how are you?
She leads our basic
Let me
needs
put my little
center,
mask on here.
and she is a graduate of SC.
Oh, I see the Trojan thing. Nice to meet you.
Some of my team that we could get here today.
Okay, so I'm going to call you back. I had lost a little bit of track of my time here, so we have until 10:30. So I do want to go into a little bit about self-care. Hopefully these are questions you all can continue these conversations in your work units or your departments or in your programs. I just think it's so important to have these conversations. So now I want to take a moment to sort of talk about you and how you're doing, okay? It's important to keep in mind that when you work with students, at the volume that you all work with students who've been impacted by trauma or ACEs, that this has an impact on you. And trauma-informed care says that we not only focus on compassionate response for our students, but compassionate response for our workforce. So I'm talking to managers, administrators, board of trustees, presidents, whoever, to keep this in mind as this is the life force of your organization. I saw a poster that said, what did it say? No care for patients until you care for the workforce or something like that. So again, if you all don't feel cared about, you can't then translate that into caring about students in the same kind of a way. So it's so important for our management team, our top administrators, to make sure that we recognize the impact of the work on the person. And again, it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It means that something happened to you. You came to work. You came to work in a field where you're working with traumatized folks. And so this is a normal occupational hazard, is that you're going to absorb some of this. And so these students tend to require more of your attention, more of your psychic energy, more of your understanding, more of your support. You start to feel overloaded, overwhelmed, because they're asking, and the well gets deeper and deeper, and you just don't have the resources. And again, this is, I think, unfortunately more true for community colleges than not. And some of their actions may even trigger your own trauma histories or grief reactions. And so again, you may end up experiencing a variety of feelings in your work. Again, we just did a little, not a little, but a huge survey at our organization, both in student health as well as in Keck medicine as a whole. And what we found from and again, we're predominantly healthcare, is that folks are burnt out. We know that physicians reported burnout at about 68% before COVID. After COVID, it has gone up to probably in the 80s at this point. So we know that people are experiencing high levels of burnout as a result of working around the COVID situation, working during COVID, the impact it has on your families, the impact it has on you, on your friends, the impact it has on your life. So all of those factors come into play when we're talking about taking care of yourself. And so even though we're going to talk about self-care, it is more than just self-care. And so in a work environment where personnel frequently work with students impacted by trauma, the organization must anticipate and normalize reactions by directly discussing the risks of vicarious traumatization. How many of you have sat in your departments and talked about how burnt out you are and what you need? Okay? Very important to make space in your staff meetings to talk about how are we going to support the well-being of the workforce. Okay? And you can take 5 minutes out of every meeting to do that. One of the things we do is that we are so zoomed out, I could spit. So this is really a pleasure to be in your presence for me. When she said, come on down, I said, I'll be there. As far away as Pasadena is, I live in Long Beach. So the other side of the county, right? And now it's usually, it used to be, I used to work at Pasadena, right? It was only like a 30-minute drive. It took me over an hour to get here. So I really wanted to be here, just to let y'all know that. Because I should have turned around when I hit that 45-minute mark. I said, I guess I got to show up. So again, how does the organization normalize what you're going through and support you? How does it carve out time? How does it look at your workload? You know, we have an insane work ethic in America. Other countries are saying, you know, let's just slow it down a little bit. Corporations are shutting down for a week or two to give their folks time to pull themselves back, to get some self-care. Because the worst thing you can do is take a vacation, kill yourself to get to vacation, and then come back and the work is up to here and kill yourself. It's like, why did I even go? You almost get to the point where I don't want to take a vacation because I have more work afterwards than I had before because the organization isn't stopping while you're gone. So having a day when the organization totally stops, you can stop. But if the organization keeps going, then it's hard when you come back. Again, doesn't mean you shouldn't take vacations. I wholeheartedly support that. And so what is our organization plan to support staff and provide personnel with the opportunity to discuss how work is affecting their lives? So this is a look at some buckets around self-care, but also I want to emphasize organizational care. What are we doing in the organization to care for ourselves and everyone in that organization? So again, this is just samples of that. And then here's some self-care activities. Does anybody know why? Oh, go back. Feel free to take a picture, but you will get the slides. Sorry, I know. Wait till the very end until you get the slides. My bad. You will get the slides, so don't break all your fingers writing. Okay, and so these are some self-care activities that you can engage in. I highly recommend taking little mini vacations. And I know that's hard in academic settings because of the academic calendar. But 4-day weekends are the best type of vacation versus a 2-week vacation. I know, where are you going with that, lady? But yeah, mini vacations are good because it makes you take a time out. 2-week vacations, I'm going to paint the house, I'm going to reorganize my closet, I'm going to build another place. You do all this stuff in 2 weeks, you cram it in those 2 weeks, and so you don't really get downtime. If you take a 4-day weekend, you tend to have more downtime where you just get to chill. So any kind of vacations where you chill, there's research that backs up that has a lasting effect greater than vacations where you're doing a whole bunch of stuff. Gardening, I always like to talk about gardening. Gardening feels great. How many people are gardeners in here? Okay. Those of you who are not gardeners, take up gardening. Why? There is a bacterium in good soil that raises the level of serotonin in your body when you put your hands in dirt. Your skin absorbs this chemical that causes more serotonin to be produced in your body. Serotonin is one of those feel-good neurotransmitters that you have in your body. So that's why gardening feels so good. Moving your body, exercise, yoga, and dancing, these are all just some activities that you can do. But again, they will not take the place of your organization stopping and talking about how do we support our workers. And that's it. Questions? I still got a minute. Woo. So any questions about anything that we've talked about? Hopefully this is just to wet your whistle, so to speak, whet your appetite for getting more into trauma-informed care, recognizing the benefits of it, also making sure that we pay attention to ourselves. How does the organization take care of us, in addition to how we are then going to be able to take care of our students? Okay, because that is vital. If the organization doesn't take care of us, we will not be available to do that for our students. We need to have a compassionate organization. Okay, we call that a parallel process, parallel practice. So any questions about anything that I mentioned or didn't mention? Yes, I saw. Oh, yes. A link. I don't have a website. I'm not that sophisticated. It's just me. What I do have, I have my contact information. So you can feel free to send me an email and I'll answer questions. I'll send literature. I'll send other information if that's what you need. But no, I'm not all of that in a website. I wish. Any other questions?
Let's thank Dr. Ingram. Thank you so much. That was incredible.
Thank
And
you.
let's also thank Dr. Carrie Boland.
I was going to say, since it's on here, I don't know if there's a way that you can save it and send it
Yeah,
out, or
yeah.
you just want me to,
Yeah, can you email it?
I'll email it too.
Just to close real quickly for me, Dr. Oliva will take it away. We will have the recording of today's session and the slides uploaded on our division page, the Division of Institutional Equity, Diversity, and Justice. So please visit there. Share this out with your folks. If you're wanting to dig a little bit deeper into this and bring this content knowledge back to your departments, your offices, et cetera, please do so, and then B, reach out. We're going to be working in consultation with Dr. Ingram to create some individual workspaces around whatever action plan you all put forth to make sure that the trauma-informed perspective and approach is incorporated in your resources, your best practices, your services, and so forth. So if you want some assistance and a thought partner alongside you to do that, please reach out, and we look forward to doing so. Part of the reason why, Dr. Oliva and I partnered in this effort is because you all serve as a front line for this work. You have the unique responsibility in engaging with our students in very intentional, intimate ways. And so you are the anchors really for them as it relates to their development here. And so we just want to make sure that you had some additional skill sets to use as you help them through their matriculation here at PCC. So thank you again for your engagement. I really appreciate it.
Before we break from each other, I did want to also recognize some of the members of our community who are serving in leadership capacities at the college this year. I want to recognize Dr. Rebecca Cobb, who was elected as the president of the Management Association. Yay. Thank you, Dr. Cobb, for your leadership on campus. We really do appreciate you. And I also wanted to thank Dr. Cristina Salazar Romo and Desiree Zuniga, who are leaders with the Abriendo Caminos Title V HSI grant. They just led our campus in Latinx Heritage Month. So let's give them a round of applause. It was a lot of hard work, and it culminated last week in unveiling our new HSI website. And so I encourage you all to check it out. It's also in the Inside Outside PCC. And I just, wanted to say thank you so much for your attention, for, being here at our first breakfast, together in almost 2 years. It was incredible to be in community with you as we learned about trauma-informed care and approaches that we can take and utilize in our practice even today. Thank you, Dr. Ingram. Again, thank you, Dr. Bolin. We really do appreciate our partners, and let's have an amazing day. And let's go Lancers this Saturday at homecoming. And go Dodgers.